What's going on, 3DMJers? I am back for another podcast episode. This time I'm with my powerlifting brethren. I got head coaches Brian Miner and Brad Loomis, and we're going to talk about something that has been close and near and dear to the heart of the OG 3DMJ crew, and that is competing in powerlifting and bodybuilding at the same time. We're talking Matt Ogus. We're talking old school Body Tribe Gym, downtown Sacramento, rapping knees, and semi-raw competition, and then the transitions that we saw in powerlifting rapidly changing. And today, it's not 2013, as much as I wish it was. I am in my 40s. TikTok is a thing. The American political system somehow got worse. And also, people are doing different things with powerlifting and bodybuilding. And we've had to adapt and change with the times. I know, it's sad. It's terrible. But no, in all seriousness, folks, the term powerbuilding has come around. And also, us silly bodybuilders who want to do strength in the off-season find that we're no longer competitive because like people who are actually built to be powerlifters, real powerlifters, are out there doing the damn thing. And people like, Russ Orhii, who could probably win a world championship in both, we're just going to ignore because it makes our egos hurt. So, anywho, we're going to talk today about how our training methods as coaches have changed when we work with dual athletes, people who compete in both powerlifting and bodybuilding, where we started kind of with the powerlifting bodybuilding craze when it first came out, honestly, before even 2013, and then where we are today, and some of the methods you can use to try to get the most out of both sports, or if you're not even necessarily competitive, if you just want to get strong and big, and you want to express that strength through the big three, what our approaches are for that. So I think the first thing I want to do is take a trip down memory lane. And I remember way back in 2005, I felt like I was a genius because I had created a program to optimize both strength and hypertrophy that I was running on my own. And I felt validated when guess what came out, folks? That.
That's what I was going to say, power hypertrophy adaptive training.
Yes. Power hypertrophy adaptive training, which Lane Norton titled that way simply so he could call it fat, even though it was definitely a strength and hypertrophy adaptive training program. And it was actually really similar to what I'd set up for myself. I was training in the heavy rep ranges with the big three, and then I was doing high reps and had a kind of a pre-daily undulating approach, if you will. And this was all the way back in 2005. Of course, for me, I've always had the dual goals of competing in both and being a strength and a physique athlete. But I know other people like you, Brad, you were a bodybuilder first who happened to train in the heavy rep ranges because you were inspired by the likes of Jeff Willett and Skip LaCour, and you were doing you were doing the Max OT method, which is kind of like compound-focused, heavy, but bodybuilding training. And I want to say you didn't do your first powerlifting meet until 2010?
Yes, that would be correct.
I remember that. You started your first powerlifting meet was at Body Tribe with us.
It was actually, I think it was 2009.
Oh, it was late 2009, because I think you attended the meet I did in February of 2009, and then you came back and you did like the Season B Body Tribe raw powerlifting meet that we had there.
I believe that's the case, yeah.
Yep, I remember that quite well. And Brian, talk to me a little bit about your history. What was the first competition you did? Was it powerlifting? Was it bodybuilding? Was one on the radar for you before the other?
It was bodybuilding. But that was 2010 was the first show I did. And then first meet, like coming out of that prep into the off season, it was similar. I think the first program that I ran was fat, something similar to that, and seeing, guys like Lane have success in both was, inspiring to see. And so that was the 2011 was the first year I did a powerlifting meet.
And it's funny to think about where we are today. There were some dissenting voices in the 20-teens. I specifically remember getting into arguments with like Ian McCarthy about our approaches as to like, hey, I don't think it makes sense to be training or investing this much time into these movements and these rep ranges. But I think the dominant voice in that era, in the 2010 to maybe even earlier, although it became most popular in kind of the early 20 scenes to 2014, 2015, was that it was actually optimal to be training for both. And I actually remember talking when we went to Australia way back in the day to some of the guys there, and they were saying that, they were working with some American coaches who were, of the lineage of Lane, who I know don't program this way anymore, pure bodybuilders, no interest in competing in powerlifting, and on their program was like 6 triples with squats, on a given day. And we're all smiling about that. But back then, and I remember this athlete even then asking like, hey, coach, does this make sense? And like, yeah, just do it. It's going to get you totally jacked. And it was like the version 1 DUP. So I was asked on a podcast recently about whether I thought I could have made better gains if I'd been training for quote unquote bodybuilding this whole time. But I think sometimes we have this revisionist history and we forget that we're constantly trying to figure out what's optimal for a given thing. And we never are there. We're getting closer and closer to it as we have a better understanding of things. But sometime 10 years ago, there was a dominant thinking pattern in the evidence-based community that powerlifting training plus hamstring curls and lateral raises was basically optimal for bodybuilding.
And bicep curls.
And bicep curls, absolutely. I almost missed out on a whole accessory movement there. And calf raises.
Yeah,
and now you're good, right? You get 3 extra movements, and then you just run, Chico 39 or whatever, and you're freaking solid. So that has definitely changed, and for good reasons. Let's talk about this a little bit. Brad, I know for you, you've worked with a lot of powerlifters. You worked with a lot of bodybuilders. Brian, I know you have too, and so have I. And the way I approached that in 2011 has definitely changed now in 2024. So Brad, for you, what are the biggest things that you think have changed in the way you work with dual athletes if you look at the history of your coaching tenure?
Yeah, I mean, right now, it's kind of funny. I could kind of summarize it in just like one little sentence. If it's a power lifter that is a dual athlete, but he's focused on powerlifting right now, it's like 90% powerlifting, 10% bodybuilding. Whereas vice versa, if it's a bodybuilder that wants to focus on bodybuilding right now, but they're kind of that dual athlete, it's 90% bodybuilding and 10% powerlifting. Boom, there you go. Thank you very much for listening to the 3DMJ podcast.
I like it.
But I mean, that's a summary of it, basically. Like I've got a very high level power lifter right now who's really kind of dabbling. He's basically just found out he's a good power lifter. But he's been a bodybuilder forever, and he's a tremendous bodybuilder. I mean, he is built for bodybuilding. And right now, that's basically what his program looks like. It's 90% powerlifting with 10%, bodybuilding. It's basically a powerlifting program with calf raises, bicep curls, and side lateral raises, right? And then, you've got the other end of the spectrum, me right now, who my love right now is powerlifting. I've had so much fun powerlifting this year, but I'm, not even that. Now I'm like 5 days out from a bodybuilding competition. So it's like, I just let my squat go. I have not deadlifted in 6 weeks. Not really benching. It's like I'm 10%. And that is now gone. So it's like I'm 0.5% powerlifting, and 99.5, bodybuilder. And that's basically it in a nutshell,
So it sounds like it comes down to our understanding of kind of like what's the minimum effective dose and then how do you periodize it?
And what's the focus right now,
Yes. Yep. And that's exactly what I would say describes the difference for me. So I remember there were some seminal pieces of research that influenced me. There was the study by Schoenfeld that I actually believe was part of his PhD, where they compared like 7 triples to 3x10 and similar or not non-significantly different volume loads and the equivalent hypertrophy but higher strength in the group that did the 7 triples. And everyone was like, sick. We just have to do more sets of heavy work and then it's just as good. Don't think about fatigue. Don't think about anything. Don't even listen to the authors who specifically said they were experiencing joint pain and felt like they couldn't handle it, while the 3x10 group was like, what, that's it? That doesn't matter. And yeah, that I think that heavily influenced a lot of people. And early on, I kind of had a 50-50 split, like you were talking about, Brad. Instead of 90-10, I would have a dual athlete who, like most of the year, was doing, say, 4 to 6s and 6 to 8 with the big 3, and then those would just get heavier closer to a meet, and then they would always have bodybuilding accessories. And then for some reason, I probably could have articulated back then, but it makes no sense to me now. They were also doing like heavy work on their bodybuilding work close to meets. Like, okay, well, now we got to do the 6 to 8 on the tricep pushdowns because that's going to transfer better to bench, which that's not a true statement. And now, farther away, we can get back to 8 to 12. That's going to be the game changer. Is the fact that your hamstring curls are, 5 pounds heavier when we're 6 weeks out from a meet. So anyway, I think that's pretty interesting because that parallels exactly where I was at. So Brian, how about you? I know there was some time you did bodybuilding, then you did powerlifting. You started coaching a bit after that, and then you probably didn't get a tremendous amount of opportunity to work with a lot of dual athletes right at the peak of this era, but shortly afterwards, I would suspect, right?
Yeah, definitely. This is a topic I've thought a lot about over the years, and I wouldn't say I'm as convinced as some people that it's highly suboptimal. And I think there's reasons for that, which I can get into, but I would say, like, as far as my approach is kind of similar to yours. You would have a powerlifting program with some added accessories. You taper, volume down as the meet approaches, increase intensity on the main lifts, and then have a competition taper and you're ready to go. And I think that works for a lot of people. But I think the biggest issue where I've changed the most is just using the big 3 less. I don't think it's impossible to have simultaneous goals and be, I don't think you're compromising significantly on both necessarily, but for hypertrophy, oftentimes the big 3 aren't the best vehicles to get somebody there, depending on their structure. And I think that's where I've kind of deviated the most. And even with powerlifters, strict powerlifters, I find, I started programming more hack squats, for example, and I think sometimes doing just squats could reinforce bad patterns of theirs. Like if they're, hips are kicking back and their quads are limited, the limiting factor, doing something like a hack squat that forces them to pull their weight, I think can be helpful for powerlifters. So what I think is the biggest issue in a practical sense is time. Because I remember when that Schoenfeld study came out, everybody was all about it. Like it was justifying everything we had been doing. And one thing that I think is easy to overlook is that group that was doing 3x10 probably could have done 5x10 in the same amount of time that they did 7x3 and made better progress. So it comes down to like a logistical issue for a lot of people. And I think that's where, my main goals right now are certainly hypertrophy, and I could back squat more and deadlift more and flat bench more. And I think I'm built reasonably well to at least get away with using those as, primary movements for hypertrophy. It might not be 100% optimal, but it's good enough, I think. But the issue is I don't have that amount of time to do both anymore. And so that I think has been the biggest constraint for me, and the fact that, like you said, Eric, the powerlifting, the depth has increased significantly from 10 years ago. And it's a lot easier to push yourself through those harder sessions, like from a competitor's perspective, when you know you're in the mix, And so it's harder, I think, to really grind through those long sessions, to maybe qualify for nationals at this point, And so and not that that's to say you shouldn't, have dual goals if if that's something you're interested in, but the opportunity cost was just too significant for me to to kind of go all in on both.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm reflecting on what you were saying, Brian, and I'm realizing like my powerlifting coaching purely, if I have an athlete as a powerlifter, has changed a lot since the last 10 years. And my bodybuilding has too. So of course, the way I approach a dual athlete will have changed. One of the things that we previously believed, and that hasn't changed, but that I'm much more convinced of now, despite some of the pushback and some, I would say, not the consensus, but there is some scientific debate against the consensus that muscle size contributes to strength, is that I think it is actually critical for powerlifters to develop muscle mass. And then you have to think about, all right, well, what's the way that I can develop a lot of muscle mass, especially in the prime movers and the muscles that contribute to the big three, which happens to be like 80% of the muscles in the body, without getting them beat up or broken. And I think one of the upsides to the relatively negative downside of kind of the ultra specificity phase of like the DUP 1.0 that came in the powerlifting world, when everyone was just doing only squat, bench, and deadlift, high volumes, high intensities. There's a lot of people who got hurt doing that, unfortunately, when we had probably too much of a focus on volume. One thing that's come of that is we've realized that specificity, while being extremely powerful, you hit kind of the maximum benefit of it relatively early. And if you're someone who is not very well built to squat or deadlift or bench with high volumes, you hit that real early and with consequences of not just seeing a performance go up, but actually risking pain or injury, unfortunately. So, yeah, there's a few things that have happened since in the research world that I think have supported that. The anecdotes we've seen in the powerlifting world is, one, we've come to realize that volume, it has a relationship with strength, but it's by no means a major player. The minimum effective dose research that Dr. Pack has done, the meta-analysis by Ralston, as well as the forthcoming volume meta-regression that the crew out of FAU is going to do, it indicates like way lower volumes than might be necessary to optimize hypertrophy are sufficient to optimize strength so long as you're lifting heavy enough loads. So even more so is when you have this very, very specific dose, like a single at a 9 RPE, if you look at Dr. Pack's research, even in well-trained powerlifters, at least in the short term, just doing a couple singles per week with a couple of back offsets is as effective as doing 10 times that amount of volume load, as we saw in one of their studies leading into Greek nationals. And I think that has absolutely been corroborated, at least in the short term. That's something that that's basically the way we kind of periodize into a meet in most cases. So the disconnect between the volumes that were being done in, say, the 2013-14 era to drive strength and the necessity of using them and our beliefs around specificity have changed for the better, in my opinion. And what that means for me as a powerlifting coach, just purely not even thinking about bodybuilding, is I'm only going to invest so much time and effort into heavy work on the big three. And after that, it's like, all right, well, I don't think after my fourth single at 90% in a given week that there's a whole lot more to milk out of this. Maybe some back off work, et cetera. But so what am I going to do with that training time, and what does this athlete need? And I think exactly like you were saying, depending upon the individual, there's different answers there. And also because of the competitiveness in powerlifting, we're starting to see a little more like natural selection or sports selection. If you look at really popular Olympic sports, all the swimmers start to look the same at the highest level. Most of the sprinters look the same, et cetera, et cetera. And that's because you can only get to that level in a sport if there's a high enough population, with rare exceptions, with having a certain build or certain physiological characteristics. And we're starting to see that in powerlifting. In a given weight class or a couple of weight classes, you start to see some very similar kind of builds. People are getting leaner. It's, of course, there's differences. You can have the person who's good at squat and deadlift, or you can have the person who is a subtotaler, or you can have the person who maybe is a really big deadlifter and is okay at bench and squat. So you can have some slightly different builds of people shake out. But for the most part, we start to see that people at the highest level can sustain a lot of training with the big three. And I think we need to understand that that's not necessarily something to emulate. It's rather a feature of the reason why they're at that level. But yeah, like big shout out to Jason Tremblay, with Taylor Atwood. He's a good example. He used almost exclusively squat, bench, and deadlift in training for him because A, he could, but B, it gave him a very clear signal to noise ratio, and he knew if he changed one thing, what it would result in. And he could actually look at the relationship between volume and performance when you're only doing the big three, because that was the only levers he was pulling, which enabled him to make decisions around changing things. But I think many athletes, if they were going to try to do all of their volume from the squat, bench, or deadlift, as we learned more than a decade ago, simply get beat up and eventually they can't. So then the question is, well, what do you do at that time? And that's where I started using, just for even pure powerlifters, a lot more bodybuilding movements and accessories, and figuring out like what's an appropriate amount of dosing of the big three that they can handle without risking anything. And almost naturally, my powerlifting programs started to look a little less skewed towards powerlifting even. I don't know if you guys have noticed that in your own training.
Sure. The example I can think of is incorporating more like hack squats or dumbbell pressing. If someone's a wide grip bench presser and they don't get a lot of like actual lengthened work, if their range of motion is very low, having something like a dumbbell press can help with development there. So yeah, I've never been like full on like high specificity in my programs. I don't know if I've ever had anyone where I've only done the big three. But the ratio of work that, is from bodybuilding is certainly increased for powerlifters, I think, over the years.
Yeah. And using and understanding specificity and that good old fashioned term periodization, right? You get a little closer to me. Yeah. Maybe men, we get a little bit more of the big three in there with some submaximal work, but far away from the competition. Yeah, let's work on the quads with belt squats and hack squats so that your butt doesn't kick out anymore. Let's work a little bit more with RDLs and reverse hypers and things like that when we can't quite get the lockout on the deadlift and things like that. So I would say, to expand on what you were talking about there, Eric, a lot of my power lifters, like deep in the off season, like far away from competition, their power lifter routines have a lot of bodybuilding in it. And it wasn't really even so much the evidence that convinced me. It was like, let's look at these high, and first of all, they're built for powerlifting, right? But of course, they also work very hard. And so then therefore they compete really, really well, right? What are they doing in the off season? They're doing belt squats, and they're doing hack squats, and they're doing pendulum squats, and they're doing a fair amount of volume, building up some good muscle mass, And then, of course, you get somebody like Russell Orey who can really pack on muscle. Then, as they start, basically getting more specific during like their last phases of kind of powerlifting prep, start getting more specific. Now, their skill even gets a little bit better in the big three, because they're doing it more often. They're getting more kind of loaded in the hole, so to speak, and pausing on their chest and, and things like that. And you notice these kind of things in their training, and it's like, wow, I've kind of missed out on the boat here, this whole time running the big three, like all the time. The more you do it, the better you get. The more you do it, the better. Well, there's that other part that you got to get in there, as well. So yeah, I think that's important to mention, is that there's periods where, you need to be, powerlifters need to be more specific toward building muscle. And of course, probably, vice versa as well.
Yep. Yeah, I would say that the typical kind of quote unquote starting template I have, which is not a template, but more of just a systematic approach to these concepts that we're talking about, is I have singles or some type of benchmark lift built into the program for a powerlifter or dual athlete, because they're still a powerlifter. They just also compete in bodybuilding throughout their entire, season, whether they're 20 weeks out from a meet or 2. And when they're 20 weeks out, it might be a triple on a safety bar squat at a 7 RPE on one day, and then just a single at a 6 RPE on their squat on another day, and that's it for their like main squatting. And then everything else is accessory work. But however, when we're 2 weeks out, it might be 3 singles in the week that are between a 7 to a 9.5 RPE, and deriving an estimated 1RM from that and comparing it to kind of that local period. And I also have different expectations. You know, when we are 20 weeks out for a meet, I just don't want to see their strength decay while I'm trying to focus on other qualities, like getting in a lot of high effort volume on movements that I know they can do a lot of without necessarily putting them in the hole in terms of recovery or joint integrity, right? So when we're in these phases further out from a meet, I'm just looking at that estimated 1RM to ensure that it's not really going down while I'm investing in trying to build size with these exercises that I can accumulate a lot of volume on at a closer proximity to failure. And the purpose of that monitoring changes as we get closer to a comp. I'm actually looking to see estimated 1RM being driven up, and that is giving me information about the success of a given block. Now, when I have a bodybuilder, the only difference there is that if we're in actual contest prep, then I'm literally thinking about what's the minimum dose that I want to have for powerlifting at this phase, and is it worth it? And we may actually want to allow a little bit of decay. And that, I think, is a useful, because it may not be worth it in the middle of contest prep, right, for bodybuilding. So I think that's the first incident where it's apparently obvious that there is a trade-off at some times for a true dual athlete. Like maybe you don't want to do big three at all at a certain phase of a bodybuilding prep. Like Brad is currently, chopped it out. He's 99.5%, bodybuilding, not 90%. Yeah, exactly. But the narrative that is in some circles currently is that there is actually a much larger trade-off of trying to be a dual athlete. There's that famous video that kind of went viral for a little bit and just annoyed everybody, myself including, that being a power builder is an abomination. The idea that there are these polar opposite goals or something like that. And I think it might be worth, I would say, dispelling that myth, which may sound ironic coming from someone who just now shifted to training purely for bodybuilding, because I think that's what I need to do to take it to the next level. But I think that's the rare case, that's the exception, and that occurs at a point in one's career that most people never get to in the first place who are concerned about this. So I don't know if you guys agree with that.
I agree completely with that. I think, I think that's why I think the argument against it is a little bit overblown for a lot of people. I mean, if you take top-level IPF powerlifters, and like obviously their program is going to look more specific to the sport than somebody else. And usually one thing I've noticed, you mentioned in those earlier stages of a meet prep, like preventing the decay in strength. One thing I have noticed though is with more advanced athletes, sometimes it takes less exposure in order to maintain proficiency. So if you take a novice and you only have them doing one single a week, you probably wouldn't expect things to go up as rapidly as if you had them doing some volume, across the week. But if you take an advanced powerlifter who needs to manage like joint integrity, and you give them in the off season, a couple singles or, a top set on each lift, and just sort of the minimum effective dose for that, they can oftentimes get away with it a little bit more.
Hey 3DMJers, just popping in with a quick announcement that we have just released our latest course in the 3DMJ Vault titled Programs for the Platform. It's by one of our head powerlifting coaches, Brad Loomis, and it's literally exactly how it sounds. He wrote 3 powerlifting programs, all of which could be used as a competition prep or as mock meets or testing weeks that you strength athletes or hybrid athletes can use in whatever way you'd like. You'll get the downloadable and editable Google spreadsheets for each of the 3 programs, along with in-depth tutorial videos on how to use the sheets, what preferences or options you can select within the sheets, and how to utilize them for attempt selection on the big 3 at the end of each cycle. There's the Find Your Max program, the Big 4 program, and the Big 6 program, which vary a little bit in frequency and ability to add accessory work within them. But once you watch all the accompanying videos, it'll be pretty easy to select which one to start with or progress to depending on your situation, your schedule, and your goals. Programs for the Platform is now the 26th course in the 3DMJ Vault, which is our online learning platform of organized video-based education for serious lifters. You can get all access to all courses with a one-time purchase of a lifetime VIP membership or a one-time purchase of a single-year VIP membership. Either way, as of 2024, this is not a recurring subscription any longer. You choose your single purchase option and you get to see everything in it for a year or for a lifetime. You'll get foundational courses like Nutrition Fundamentals for Lifters, Personalizing Your Program, Calculating Your Calories, Bodybuilding Program Design, Calculating Your Macros, and the Lifting Library. You'll also get more specific accessory courses like the Advanced Deload Guide, Transitioning Away from Tracking, the Godfather's Guide to Posing, the Lagging Body Parts course, the Physique Photo Guide, and more. So head on over to 3dmjvault.com and sign yourself up for a VIP membership today. That's 3dmjvault.com to get all access. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the rest of the show.
One thing I think would be helpful is we kind of list the proposed benefits of power building. Like back in 2011 when this was popular, beginning to become popular, and people thought, okay, this is the best way to train. Like, why did we think that? And what are some arguments against that? And what are some arguments for why this is an abomination? And what are some arguments against that? Because for me, originally, the idea of powerlifting in the off season being optimal was getting stronger leads to more muscle mass. And I think it's correlated for sure, but really it's, anything you're going to be getting strong. Yeah, it's kind of the opposite, really. Like as you get bigger, you have a greater capacity for strength. And, like you said before, hypertrophy is very highly correlated with strength. And so we can't neglect, like if you take a novice and put them in a hyper-specific strength program, like they're going to top out a lot sooner than somebody that started as a bodybuilder, I think. And you see this with a lot of, especially now with social media, a lot of junior lifters that are hyper-specialized in powerlifting, eventually they get to a point where it's like, okay, you just need to put on more muscle in order to level up from here. You've kind of maxed out your weight class based off of, neurological adaptations in themselves. So I think it is sort of a backwards approach, thinking, okay, getting stronger it's kind of a byproduct of getting bigger when it comes to hypertrophy. But when it's not, it's usually neurological gains, which aren't really impacting hypertrophy. So there's a disconnect there. And I think once I understood that, it was easier to kind of justify going a little bit less specific. And, on the topic of specificity, when people think specificity for powerlifting, they think 90% and above, big 3. But across an entire annual training plan, what's specific should be what's specific for the current goal. And so if you're in the off season and you're focused on muscular development, a high specificity plan, if you're not built to squat, bench, and deadlift, might not have any of those in them. And so I think that's another thing to consider is when we talk about specificity, it's within the context of what the short-term goal for that training block is. Yeah. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just kind of the opposite too, and what I mean by that is, it comes down to the level of the athlete, because arguably a high level, more advanced athlete, while they may need to get a little bit more specific closer to the meet, like you said, Brian, they tend to hold on to their strength very, very well. And if we did our job and built some muscle in the off season, we may not have to push so hard and hit a lot of like RPE 9.5, 10 in those final weeks. We can wait until the meet when they can actually put that muscle to good use and kind of like surprise themselves. I mean, I don't know if you guys have seen that, but you know, with a high level athlete, we won't even push hard. You know, we'll touch it, but it's really game day when we want to really truly express those levels of strength. Now, I'll do the exact opposite if it's kind of a more intermediate type power lifter, or even like a novice power lifter who doesn't have that skill of grinding and doing really heavy work yet, and is not they haven't touched it as often, right? Now, on those athletes, as we kind of get closer and closer to the meet, there I might touch, let's get an RPE 10 2 weeks out. You know what I mean? Maybe do some more RPE 9s 3 and 4 weeks out, just so that we can kind of get them built and feeling that those heavy, grindy repetitions, so that they can perform better on their game day, right? So, yeah, that's what you were kind of referring to, Brian. I wanted to make sure we kind of fast forwarded to the end game too, and the differences in those athletes as well. You know,
it's a good point.
So, yeah, and then Eric, however you want to expand on that as well.
No, that's a great point. Like a lot of when I work with someone has lifted but is new to powerlifting, I include singles in like the 7 to 9 RPE range super frequently, because they will just keep going up, and it will be at a relatively low cost because the athlete is not yet expressing their true peak potential strength at a given phase, right? And you can just see it go up pretty much every time they repeat a single at a similar RPE for months sometimes. And then all of a sudden they're like, Coach, these singles are really beating me up. Like, they're hard, they're mentally taxing. It's still a single at 8, even like it was 2 months ago, but they're expressing much more psychological and physical fatigue from it, because now it's 100 kilos heavier, right? And that may be an exaggeration in most cases, but you get my point. And you know, back to what you said, Brian, about their understanding previously, it was partially correct. We had some things right, and I think it is worth talking about, like, what were our beliefs around why a power building approach was optimal for even pure bodybuilding back in the day, and what of those things were half right, which of those things were plain wrong, and what things were we actually onto something. One of the things that was related but wrong, like you mentioned, was that being stronger allows you to grow better. And I think the main argument was that if I'm stronger, therefore my volume load will be higher. And this was kind of just a product of the logical beliefs we had at the time, like volume is associated with hypertrophy. That's true, but we tracked volume in a way that was probably only useful within individual on a lift. And that was volume load. And therefore we're thinking, okay, sets times reps times load. If I'm using more load, I don't have to change my sets and reps, and I'm doing more volume. That means I'm getting bigger. And that almost makes it sound like the stronger you get this like logarithmic growth out of doing the same amount of sets and reps. And that's just not true. But one thing that is true is in the short term, it's very difficult to take a movement you're unfamiliar with, or that you're not neuromuscularly adapted to. You don't have the basic motor pattern consistent and down, and actually growing from it. And this has been observed in studies of like untrained individuals even. There's a study of untrained women for 12 weeks where they did mid-testing at the 6-week mark, and they're doing bicep curls, leg press, and bench press. And you see some massive strength gains in all 3 lifts at the 6-week mark, but really no changes in muscle mass in the trunk or legs at the 6 weeks mark, but definitely you do in the biceps. So it's like, it's not hard to learn how to do a bicep curl, but the leg press, bench press, there's some co-activation you got to turn off and figure out how much to do, neuromuscular coordination, and just some basic motor learning. And then at the 12-week mark, on all of a sudden now we can observe those changes in the lower body and the trunk. But that's different than, I squat 405, but if I actually knew what I was doing, I could squat 475. It's related. It's a similar concept, but it's not quite the same thing. And it's not saying if you can just increase your strength, you're going to grow more because you're doing more volume or more volume load. So I think that's one of the things we had wrong. One of the things we had right is that while it's not a huge piece of the puzzle of how to optimize hypertrophy, it does seem on balance when we look across studies that training across a broader spectrum of rep ranges might be independently better for hypertrophy rather than just staying narrowly in like the 8 to 12 rep range. We've got a few different studies, a few different designs, and a few different styles of periodization where we see either significantly better or better, but not necessarily reaching the threshold for statistical significance, where having a broader high rep and low rep, by the way, is potentially better than just doing the stock standard 8 to 12. So I think that's worth pointing out. And I think it's also worth pointing out that the more demanding motor learning task of using free weight compound lifts, where you really are forced to brace, be aware of where your body is in space, manage your joints, and think about how you feel at multiple different points. I think there's a lot of transference there that is probably good from a kind of more general learning pattern. And someone, like if you take a powerlifter, and I've trained with many of them who have transitioned away from powerlifting into bodybuilding, there are some things you have to unlearn, but some things also come quite quickly. Like once they start getting into other variations of pressing, other variations of squatting, or kind of hinge patterns, they generally do pretty well. They know how to keep a tight core, they know how to express a lot of force, and they can move some big weights pretty quickly. The main thing you have to unlearn, just to kind of square that circle, is getting them away from the idea of like there's a different level of effort that you put into accessory work or main lifts. That seems to be something that I would say actually power builders or dual athletes have a distinct advantage on. There are some powerlifters, in my opinion, who hold themselves back because the level of effort they put into their accessories is essentially like, let me do this cardio circuit afterwards. And you get the 700-pound deadlifter who's doing sets of 6 with 315 on RDL, and you're like, bro, like if you want to go on a walk, go for it. Get your dog and go for it and do something. But I don't know that doing sets of 6 with 50% of 1RM is doing much for you. Yeah. So I think that is one area where, even though on paper one might be theoretically worse than the other, or at least forcing you to balance potential bottlenecks, the effort level put forth across the board and someone who competes in bodybuilding and powerlifting tends to be appropriate, at least what you program. Mm-hmm. I've found as a coach, where sometimes I get videos from pure powerlifters on their accessory work, and I'm like, all right, like your Bulgarian split squats with 30-pound dumbbells, you squat 600 pounds. Stop it. Like, what are you doing? If like go play cards or something like that if you're going to do that. So it's that's something I've noticed. So I think there's a few theoretical benefits here. One, probably not true. The higher volume load from being stronger isn't making you bigger. However, getting more neuromuscularly adapted to a given lift will allow you to actually get more out of it physiologically, to your detriment or to your benefit, depending upon if you're trying to do a high frequency of heavy lifts, which can really, really tax you. Training across rep ranges and training both heavy and light, I do think has a small potential benefit for hypertrophy broadly. The mechanism's not super clear, but it does seem to be something that shakes out in some of the applied literature. And then the rationale against it, I think painting with too broad of brush strokes, but these are true in some instances, are stimulus to fatigue ratio. Like the idea that for everybody, a squat has a poor stimulus fatigue ratio for training your glutes and quads. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think for people who can stay relatively upright, don't have a history of injury, have good range of motion, and can maintain a pretty tight movement pattern without tremendous deviation when they get close to failure on a squat, are they really getting something more out of doing a hack squat or a slightly feet shifted forward Smith's machine squat or a pendulum squat? I think no. I think that's more or less identical things you can swap out, or the marginal benefits are not worth discussing, in my opinion. However, for someone else, really long femurs, really shitty dorsiflexion, prior history of lumbar injury. One is I can only do 2 sets per week, or it hurts, or I can do 15 sets, and it's a complete game changer. So this needs to be, I think, assessed on a very individual basis, the whole idea of the stimulus fatigue to fatigue ratio. Just because something is an axially loaded barbell movement doesn't mean it's inherently worse for bodybuilding by any means. And there are some upsides to doing these free weight compound lifts where there's probably, to some degree, greater stimulus of your whole body. Now, it may not be as targeted or as biased, but if I had to guess, like, if it really came down to it, is a hack squat or a barbell squat going to produce more overall hypertrophy stimulus if we don't care about what tissue is growing? I might guess the barbell squat.
I would too.
Yeah, it's probably not worth it. And it's probably not necessarily what we want. Again, that's why it comes down to that kind of ratio. But it's worth noting that when you're doing compound exercises compared to isolation movements, there are multiple things you can train at once, which does induce more fatigue, but that may or may not be worth it in some cases. So I think that's one of the counters to the current narrative, the whole stimulus to fatigue ratio. And then the other counter narrative, or rather the other kind of broad brushstroke, is not the fatigue, but the efficiency or the effectiveness of exercises. That, you know, we can bias a given muscle or group of muscles better with more targeted exercise selection. And again, I think that is true when it is true, but there are times when it doesn't make a big enough difference. And I think for the bench and the squat specifically, those are examples, and generally pressing and most of your quad work, where you don't have a whole tremendous amount of opportunity to really optimize those movements more in someone who can perform them well. All pressing is hardest when free weight pressing, when your muscle is already in a lengthened position. You know, if you were to take away the stretch reflex in the bottom of a back squat, the sticking point would basically be in the very deepest part of the hole, not 2 inches out of it after the passive tension you produce kind of runs out and you hit that sticking point. So a squat and a bench press, if you have a crazy super wide grip powerlifting arch, not ideal. But from kind of a basic consideration of the biomechanics of these lifts, like if you were just to do a chest press or a squat pattern, I mean, when we optimize them, they just become, don't arch, move your grip in a little bit, maybe think of a cambered bar or do dumbbells. Yeah. Or you put the bar somewhere else than in a low bar position. But a back squat and a bench press are already on the table as being a pretty good profile as far as hypertrophy. The deadlift, if you can perform that eccentric and maybe get a little more range, it could be better. But yeah, that's where I would make more of a general agreement. But I think we make these assumptions that if we were to able to bias it better, there's not a whole lot like left to milk out of some of these lifts when we think about it objectively. And I think we're just generally painting with far too broad of brushstrokes. And then the third point is that the result of those first 2 points together are going to mean that you're compromising something as far of how much of your growth you're going to get. And I think there's one of the ways we don't think about this correctly is, what does that mean? If you say you can get 80% of your gains if you do power building versus 100% if you focused on one or the other, does that mean ever? Does that mean right now? Is that the rate of progress? And I think the answer is far more nuanced. I think generally what I've seen in research and as a coach, that when you get in the realm of good enough and you have a sufficient dose of training that's specific enough to the adaptation, for someone who's a novice, you top out the amount of gains you can make in many cases. So if you have a decent program versus a hyper-optimal program and they're eating enough and there's a sufficient amount of volume and proximity to failure, but one's a little more tweaked biomechanically, I don't think a novice is going to notice any difference. I think they're going to get a saturated signal, if you will, for hypertrophy pretty early. And potentially for strength too, if you have those big practice lifts in there based upon the minimum effective dose training. And the idea that you're sacrificing something if you could optimize it, it's just not true. Those optimization problems, by definition, occur at a point where you need such a high dose and such a specific dose that you are far more trained. And I think a lot of the people who are talking about this don't have the level of skill in powerlifting or the level of development in bodybuilding where there needs to be a compromise. I think where they are true is that by doing both at the same time and optimizing the signals for both, there is more fatigue. You might have to invest more time, and there might be more of an experienced cost, and you may have to be a little more careful about fatigue management, but you can still get 100% signal through your intermediate phase, compared to getting 100% for bodybuilding or powerlifting in isolation, but experiencing less fatigue because you are being forced into choosing slightly more fatiguing movements. But I think it's a while in someone's career before fatigue and logistics become the bottleneck to that choice. I don't know if you guys agree with that.
If ever. I'm kind of wondering if you ever get to that point. It seems like you would have to be. Well, then I kind of talk about that a little bit too, because I mean that's kind of something that I think that I'm still, even at 52 years old, that I don't think that I think I'm still pretty far from, you know.
Yeah. So okay, I'll talk about my personal experience. I think that might be helpful for people to know. I have from the start, when I first started lifting in 2004, tried to be the strongest and the biggest I could. And what my first competition in 2006 was push-pull meet. And then that was in August 2006. And then I did my first show in May 2007. And I did my next show 2 weeks after that. And then I did my next powerlifting meet later that year. And basically since 2007, I've been competing almost every year in both bodybuilding and powerlifting. And then I went through a phase where I was doing other strength sports as well. So for me, as someone who is not necessarily super well gifted as a strength athlete, 6 foot, not perfectly well built for it, but I'm fine. I have found that the amount of work that I need to do currently to push my total up and the amount of specificity that's needed is very time demanding. When I moved my total from the 600 to 630-ish range, which I didn't get to express because of COVID, that took me squatting 3 to 4 times a week, deadlifting 2 to 3 times a week, and benching 5 to 6 times a week. Top singles, back offsets, and doing accessory work. So I was training close to 12 to 15 hours a week of powerlifting, more specific training. I didn't shrink, don't get me wrong. I was certainly muscular, but I was trying to find time to do things like hamstring curls, bicep curls, and calf raises. And I was also experiencing problems that I had to work around. So at a certain point, with the level of frequency and volume on arched bench press, and also low bar squats, I would get pain in my upper arm and my elbow from the low bar squat position. And I'd have to bring bench press out in front because benching after squatting would cause enough pain that it would, acutely, it would fade, that I couldn't actually bench my top end. So now I'm shifting bench press forward. And on a day like that, I can't do a bicep curl. That just be literally felt like dumping salt on a wound. Okay, so now I got to shift my bicep curls to the day where I do, deadlift bench. Okay, and I only have one day I can bicep curl. That's a little bit less than ideal, right? All right, calf raises, I can work that in, no problem. Hamstring curls, all right, well, I'm actually really riding the line. I did get a hamstring strain last time I competed. Maybe I need to be careful about the total dosage there. Okay, I'll put that here. So those types of bottlenecks became apparent. And in hindsight now, based upon the progress I've made, emphasizing a lot more ergogenically joint integritous lifts that fit my body better, to use unnecessarily large words, if they are even words, getting away from the big three, and the progress I've made in my physique in a relatively short time period, it's made me realize wow, the logistics problem was actually preventing me from doing what was optimal for bodybuilding. And now I look at, okay, maybe not all of what I'm doing right now is optimal for bodybuilding. I might be going above and beyond. I could be using, I wouldn't say a shotgun to kill a fly, but maybe an unnecessarily large fly swatter because I'm really invested in my goals, right? But where is the time right now for me to invest in the big three, right? Obviously I could put them in. I could put the big three in, and then I could pull back on RDLs. I could pull back on leg press a bit, and I could pull back on some of my chest pressing. But the amount I'd have to pull back there to get a sufficient amount to actually not just maintain my strength, but move the needle forward And now all of a sudden I'm training 7 days a week and putting 20 hours per week into my training and managing recovery on what feels like a tightrope. And I just don't think I could actually optimize simultaneously either outcome. And while I could periodize and optimize one individually, the time away from one would at least be hitting pause on the other. But it took me, 15, I don't know, when did I get to this point? Maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago. For me, it was right around like a 600 kilo total, which if I had to guess is about 90% of maybe the peak total I think I could achieve realistically. And maybe somewhere around 90, 95% or even higher of my most amount of muscularity. So it did become eventually an optimization game, but I don't think, and I don't want to sound arrogant, but I just don't think most people get this close to their potential in either sport until they're actually at the top of the sport.
Yep.
So
one thing I wanted to mention is there's a study, is it August Sawara, the 2013? Yes. So I think it was untrained, which I guess to support your argument, like let's say novice to intermediate, this is granted they're more trained than untrained, but the untrained individuals were split into 2 groups. One group trained, I think it was just bench press they did. It was, I think 3x10, like 75% or something. It was 24 straight weeks of doing that. And I can't remember the exact frequency. It might have been 3 days a week or something. But the other group was same protocol, but they were 6 weeks on, 3 weeks where they did nothing, 6 weeks on, 3 weeks where they did nothing, then 6 weeks on. And so the total time spent training was less on the group that was taking these breaks, obviously. And they did detrain some, and I forget, Eric, you probably know like the method of how they measured hypertrophy here, but they did lose some size in those 3 weeks. But what they found was that by the end of the 24 weeks, they had actually regained and kind of caught back up to the group that was continuously training through. So there's 2 kind of things that I took out of that. And one of them is in support of what you're saying. You know, if you're a novice or not as well trained or not as high level in either sport, there's not going to be a huge cost associated from hitting pause on something and then returning to it later. So let's say you wanted to do a meet. You're a bodybuilder in the middle of your off season, you want to do a powerlifting meet. And the argument against that would be like, okay, that's, you know, that 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever your meet prep is, that's time away from building muscle. Well, we know, I guess, at least based off of this research, is not that you would take 12 weeks off, but you're probably doing enough to maintain muscle at least. And so you're whether it's a resensitization to the training stimulus, mechanistically, I'm not sure what is occurring there, but you regain ground quickly. So to your point about, okay, are we compromising acutely, or are we compromising over the long term? Over the long term, I don't think it is a huge compromise, especially until you get to the high levels. And so the other takeaway I took from that is, like, if I go on vacation and I don't want to train, like we went to Belize a couple of years ago and I had every intention of training, but if you've been there before, like where we were is like it was just golf carts, and like we drove golf carts on these dirt roads, and the gym was like 50 minutes away. So I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to train for 2 hours, tack on another, 2 hours of commute and golf cart to train one time, so I didn't train. And I remember it felt wrong. And yeah, I was detrained slightly when I got back, but within 2 weeks I was back and above where I was before. So it gave me peace of mind to, like, don't feel pressured to train when logistically it's just unfeasible, or a high inconvenience anyway. So, but I think that, yeah, I think that sort of lends support to what you're saying, is a lot of the people that are making these, critiques on TikTok or whatever, like they're in the earlier stages of their training career in many cases, and it probably doesn't affect them as much as it would someone who's been training for, 2.5, 3 decades.
How many people do we encounter that, although it's kind of unhealthy, they feel guilty when they don't train?
Yeah, and that's the thing.
You know,
Like
there's that psychological part. They're like, oh, well, I didn't get my 6th day in this week, or I've had 4 days off from training my upper body when you count my lower body, and then 2 days, and then, you know, et cetera. And it's like, you're worried about something that you really don't need to be worried about, you know? So
it sucks
now
the
we've got
joy
an
out of the
anecdotal
process.
and an actual, we've got an anecdotal and an actual evidence-based reason that's irrational, you know?
And then, Eric, there's also that Carvalho study where was it a 12-week? I think it was a 12-week study, and one group was doing sets of, I think it was 1 to 3 or 3 to 5. One group was doing significantly less volume, but at high intensities. And the other group trained 12 weeks through. I forget what the rep range was.
Yeah, it was actually an interesting setup. Everybody did 4 weeks of hypertrophy training to start.
To lead into it, that's right.
Yeah,
right.
And then there was an 8-week period where they either did hypertrophy or strength training in the 2 groups, and they finished with another 4 weeks of hypertrophy. So the group that did strength in the middle, the gains were very marginal, and whether it was significantly different depends upon your interpretation, but they were definitely leaning in favor of the group that did that strength block in the middle of the 2 4-week periods of hypertrophy training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and by the end of it, hypertrophy outcomes were similar in that.
They were similar, or maybe even slightly favoring the group that did the strength block.
So I guess if you look at the August Suarez study and you think like, okay, well, I'm not taking 3 weeks off, I'm doing an actual meet prep. This is sort of probably more in line with that, where, okay, this is time spent away from more submaximal loading, where volume load is going to be lower. You know, effective reps, if we want to kind of use that concept here, would be less. But the outcomes are similar. So I don't think if you're an off-season bodybuilder who's in that intermediate stage, even if you want to do a meet, I wouldn't hesitate based off the idea or assumption that you're going to like sabotage progress for hypertrophy.
Absolutely. I understand where the logic stems from, right? If it's okay, Eric, well, even if I buy what you're saying, that I can get the same amount of progress, but it's just less efficient. I have to put more time and effort in to do it, into both. Well, if that's true, then couldn't I take one of those away and I'd have all this efficiency left, and I could do even more for either powerlifting or strength? Well, again, the issue there is, what if you've already maxed out your rate of progress, which is a thing, you know, or there's other consequences to then making it all one or the other, you know. And I think you basically need to get to a point where any loss of efficiency is also a loss in gains, right? And that is only going to happen in people who have a high work requirement to make progress, and they can recover from it, and there's no logistical barrier to it. But 90% of the time, in my experience as a coach, the barriers to how much time someone invests into their training are not related to what do they think they can actually adapt from, but how much time they have in the day, how much they're willing to do, and then prior injury history.
What their body can hold up to,
Exactly. And how long is their commute to the gym, stuff like that, you know?
Do they have kids?
Exactly.
That's a big one for me.
Right. And that's why, you look at some people in certain sports, and being an amateur athlete is a notable decrement and going to prevent them from being at the highest level. I think if you look at Olympic weightlifting and the challenges that U.S. athletes have compared to some of the athletes in other countries where they're actually they're getting at least some compensation and they can be basically just a full-time Olympic weightlifter. But it's a much more skill-dependent sport, and there's no eccentric component. And it's, there's reasons why more practice is going to result in a better outcome, even if it's marginal, less efficient gains. You take the average Olympic weightlifter in the U.S., and they're wishing they had a little more time to invest into it, but they have a job, they have a life, right? They try to get sponsors, they try to make it happen, and we've improved a little bit now that we've had CrossFit, providing a lower age entry point for Olympic weightlifting and a larger pool of athletes to kind of get on the same level as some of the Asian and Eastern Bloc countries. But it's not like all of a sudden CrossFit has saved American weightlifting, and now we're getting proportional levels of performance. And some of that's because, they're all playing football. But I think not entirely. I think a part of it is that some of these sports where you can potentially benefit just from investing more and more and more and more and more time, you will see athletes who don't have to balance life quite as much doing better. But I don't think bodybuilding and powerlifting are necessarily to that degree. Like, even when we talk about some of the extremely high volume studies out there, and if we were to extrapolate that and assume it would apply to a balanced program rather than what's been studied, which are largely kind of like what we describe as specialization programs. And if we extrapolate out that is sustainable for more than 8 weeks at a time, we go, okay, listen, you got to do 30 to 40 sets on everything. I actually think if you got someone who is in decent shape and did 30 to 40 sets on literally every muscle group and you plan that out, that it still wouldn't take more than about 10 hours per week. And you just, it's all you need to do. That's all you can do. You can't benefit from more. That's it, And I think that is also the true for powerlifting. Like, I've trained with powerlifters and Olympic weightlifters at the highest level. There is a limit to how much you can do that you benefit from for powerlifting. And the data bears that out as well for strength. And it's because it really beats you up. You don't get to drop the bar except on deadlifts. And you're performing eccentrics. It's heavy loading. You're close to failure. So I think this idea of it being this logistics kind of optimization game is true for a select few people who are pushing close to the limits and also seem to need and benefit from a higher volume approach. But that's not everybody. So yeah, I think that's not an incorrect statement to say that it's less efficient to train for both sports at the same time. I think it is true. But I think the assumption that because it's less efficient, you're actually costing yourself the bottom line, that is only true sometimes. But what is typically true is that loss of efficiency means more time investment or a greater perceived total effort to get the same outcome. And that may be true at the novice and intermediate level. But so long as you're okay with that and you can fit it into your life, then it is what it is, but you're not actually losing anything on your bottom line.
It's well said.
Two points that I want to kind of at least throw in there. First of all, kind of a simpler concept, right? Just basically client buy-in, athlete buy-in. You've taken all this, if you're still listening, and you're like, okay, so what do I do, right? Hire a coach, commit to one or the other. The big thing is I feel like so many times our bodybuilders, when we put them on like a kind of a more of a power lifter type of a program, to them, it's kind of like, okay, a heavy singlets and back downs. That means I'm going to do a 1 rep max and 3 AMRAPs. And it's like, no, take that bodybuilder thinking out. That's not what we're doing here, we literally got to kind of think more like a power lifter. You get the training done. We get the effective stimulus there. And then, of course, like you said, Eric, you've got the power lifter who now is going to do the bodybuilding and they're grabbing the 30-pound dumbbells and doing split squats when they can, squat 400, 500, 600 pounds. It's like, okay, now we got to get away from that thinking of, okay, I just got to get the training done and get the effective stimulus. And we actually got to kind of make it hard. You know what I mean? So I want to just make sure that we kind of convey to the listener that, when you're kind of dabbling in more of a power builder type of a setup, actually do the training the way that it's intended to do. Don't take your version of the training and then try to run it the way that you think that it's done in that particular, program, and vice versa. Because, one and two things is going to happen, like we talked about. Either A, you're going to break, or B, you're not going to either express your true strength on the platform, or you're not going to get the true muscle that you're meant to get from the from the bodybuilding, the powerlifter doing the bodybuilding training, So yeah, I just kind of wanted to drive that point home because so many times we will see that, what I mean? They're trying to adapt bodybuilding approaches and thinking into a powerlifting program and vice versa. So Brian, did you want to, you're nodding your head. Did you want to expand on that at all?
I agree with that. I think one thing I kind of take from that is if you're a dual athlete who's preparing for a meet, like taper your accessories down as well. I mean, there's a reason tapers work. Like we have so much capacity to recover, and we can't just taper the main lifts, and like you that would be suboptimal. If you're still redlining bodybuilding but tapering your main lifts, like recognize and establish what the short-term goal is, and it's to peak for the meet, and put everything on maintenance mode in terms of hypertrophy and pay down some of that fatigue debt. That way you can actually perform, and meet your expectations on the platform.
Well said.
And know that, if you did listen to all of that, that you're not going to be leaving stuff on the table, right?
Yeah.
It's okay,
I think maybe what I want to end on is reminding people how do we get here in the first place? And the reason why we at 3DMJ actually started promoting kind of a blended approach, and why we were part of kind of the revolution of creating a lot of hybrid or dual sport or power building athletes, wasn't necessarily for those popularized beliefs that was the justification for doing it at the time, but they were more cultural. And fortunately, some of these cultural shifts have changed. So one of the things that actually hasn't changed is that it's really common for bodybuilders to feel an empty nest syndrome and to feel post-contest blues. And that's true of any time you do anything hard in life that has a natural endpoint. There's going to be, after every peak, there's a valley. You get married, you go on your honeymoon, first couple of years are great, and then it's kind of, so this is just, now we're just living together. And you have to be intentional in your relationship to have that be a positive thing, right? You finish a degree, now what? I'm in a job search. I wake up every morning early. I think I need to go to school. There's these transitions in life, especially when they have a lot of emotional drive behind them. If you're committed to them, you're very desiring of the outcome, and they have an emotional spike, it's going to be challenging afterwards. And one of the things that we saw was that by giving bodybuilders a goal after their competitive season of, hey, let's see if we can do a powerlifting meet, we could smooth that over, keep them motivated, keep that quote unquote fire burning. Another issue was that back in the day when we started, I vividly remember asking a very small room of bodybuilders at a seminar that we did, hey, how do you define a good leg day? And I've told this story before, but I got two different responses, and they're both variations on I need to feel like I got hit by a truck, with no mention of progressive overload or seeing some type of objective performance increase. So if you think about those two issues, like one is a lack of understanding that, yes, of course, progressive overload or overload that results in progression, to give Brian Miner the shout out he deserves, should feel hard at a certain point. Feeling hard is not necessarily the only goal. And if we are not seeing the outcome of getting bigger, the correlation of strength going up, reps, load, however you want to count it, maybe we're not actually growing. We need some of these monitoring indicators of gym performance. So getting bodybuilders to actually focus on progressive overload, that was a big issue 15 years ago. I'd say it's much less of an issue now. That's something that a lot more people understand, and it's a lot more baked in. People are trying to beat the logbook, and that's fantastic. And that, of course, existed 10 years ago. I mean, think about DC training and a lot of others, but it is, I would say, it was more niche back then. It was within specific corners of the bodybuilding world. But now it's something that is baked into the majority, which is great to see. So maybe, at the time, we were borrowing ideas from powerlifters to bake in, okay, now we can get you to focus on progressive overload, and now we've given you an off-season goal. We've prevented that empty nest syndrome. And I would say powerlifting was a great fit for that, but it's not the only way to do that. You can sit down with an athlete 6 weeks out and start planning some off-season goals. You can start planning some things that don't result in them getting on a powerlifting platform and focusing on their new 6-rep maxes, or just let's try a new program, or let's work on these new lifts, or I really want to emphasize X, Y, and Z. And you can create some of those buffers to smooth that kind of natural depression that comes after a contest season, and giving something for the athlete to focus on without necessarily getting on the platform. And likewise, we can bake in progressive overload and emphasize the importance without them needing to get on the platform and hit a PR on their total. So I think it's just important to understand, like, what was the history and the rationale. And it's some of these cultural attaches to powerlifting and bodybuilding that made them a good fit 15 years ago that are maybe not quite as good of a fit now that we have a better understanding of both. It wasn't necessarily us going, oh yeah, the volume load and you got to get stronger to get bigger. In fact, I don't necessarily think we believe either one of those with great confidence. I'll speak for myself. I was maybe buying into the volume load thing at a certain point. But yeah, that was our rationale. And that, I think, is something that is sometimes lost in some of the critiques that occur today. People forget what those actual reasons were and what it was like in bodybuilding culturally at the time.
Well, and talk about too the exact opposite from the bodybuilder we were kind of doing powerlifting, right? Think about the powerlifter that just expressed the best performance that they've ever had, and now they can't do that. It's really hard when you hit a PR on the platform on a big day, knowing now that you can do that, and then try to duplicate that in weeks and months. A lot of times it can't happen. When everything came together at the perfect time, it's hard to deal with that mentally. Well, let's shift our focus a little bit, Let's go ahead and think about more of this bodybuilder type stuff. Let's get you underneath the pendulum squat and, let's make you work really, really hard. Let's see if we can actually make your quad sore, training through that burn, maybe we do kind of do some bodybuilding leg extensions and leg curls, and let's kind of focus less on quantitative type things. And let's focus on how long does it take to actually fail on leg curls? You know what I mean? How many powerlifters do that? But yet how effective is that at building muscle? So kind of the opposite too. Those blues happen for powerlifters too, and so maybe we can kind of use some of those things that we used to use back in the day to keep the motivation up and to keep the training enthusiasm there and keep the training there, for our powerlifting brethren too. So
actually, that's a really good point, Brad. I can't tell you how many times powerlifters have come to me. They're a little dinged up physically, but they're also very mentally fatigued from always looking to see the numbers go up and feeling that their day-to-day happiness is tied to an estimated 1RM, or their weekly happiness is tied to that SBD day on Saturday, right? And man, it can be such a breath of fresh air to just not have the burden of comparison in your program for a while.
Just no numbers. Just get on that machine, put a load on there, and just do it till you can't do it anymore. That is sometimes so refreshing.
Absolutely. Bodybuilding phases can be really, really good for an athlete. And if you intentionally do them and you periodize them, they can really unburden the athlete to some degree mentally. I remember Johnny Candido talking about this probably close to a decade ago now, about eating the single. And maybe not quite a decade ago, but the idea of you've always got singles at 8 in your program kind of deal, or something close to that, but heavy singles on the big 3 to maintain that skill while you go through different phases. And he said eating the single, meaning you're going to do it and it's going to tell you you're 30 kilos weaker than you were at your peak, and that's okay. And you just have to eat it because it's awful. Like it's, asparagus and you don't like vegetables or something like that, which I think asparagus tastes great, but I've heard people don't like it. And so I think that's part of the reason why I program like low frequency, low RPE singles, because I'm not sure, like I don't think like, oh no, we're doing a lot of bodybuilding work and the single at a 7 RPE, that's going to put you in the hole. But the single at the 5 RPE, you'll have no problem doing before you're training. Like, yeah, it's objectively less fatigue. It's a lower weight for a single, but the difference is probably minuscule, and there's maybe only one additional warm-up set that you'd need to do to get to a single at a 7 versus a single at a 5. But what I don't want to do is give you something that easy to compare to your actual 1 rep max.
That's a good point.
I'd rather have you know,
really
like if you do a single at a 5 RPE, you don't really care whether it was 160 or 170 when your back squat max is 210, because you can rationalize that away to mean anything.
Yeah.
I want it to maintain the skill of the squat. I want it to maybe see how it compares to your other singles at a 5 or a 6. But the main thing I want you to focus on is hitting a 9 RPE on your leg press, for 10 reps or whatever it is. So I think 100%, Brad, that's a really, really good point that should not go unnoticed. Is if we flip it and look at it from the powerlifter perspective, there may be mental benefits to preventing burnout and keeping you in the game and having a little more variety, especially for the powerlifters who need it, because not all of them are great at being kind of the mental, monotonous beast who just is happy ticking away on the big three, squat, bench, deadlift. I do think there's some mental selection for high level performance in powerlifting too. People who really kind of like comfort in the same movements and don't need a lot of variety, but that's not everybody. And I think you can still make it to a high level if you don't have that kind of mental bias. So for those athletes, getting into a bodybuilding phase where the closest thing they got to worry about is a variation on the big three for a single at a 6 RPE, and then just doing a lot of rep work on accessories and sending those videos to their coach maybe, and having that be the focus. And, are we really like digging into those quads at a long muscle length and getting close to failure? I think that can be very refreshing and can be a really nice mental break. So that's an excellent point. Team.
I got my list crossed off.
You got your list crossed off. How about you, Brian?
I don't really have any. Oh, the only thing I was going to add to Brad's was sometimes just going in, just pushing to failure, not logging anything. Like that kind of has progressive overload baked into it in a sense. And that's how they do it in a lot of like research. You 8 to 12 RM, if you fall outside the range, increase weight. And so those additional reps will come as the adaptations accommodate them. So if you're just tired of spreadsheets and calculating based off percentages, and that's one thing, you go to the average gym, like a bodybuilding gym, some of the people aren't logbooking stuff and they're still making progress, but a lot of them are training very close to failure and they just check the boxes without quantifying it.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, say what you will about some of the more dogmatic approaches to high intensity, but if I had to choose one, there's one variable that I want to see someone, ramp up a little less with less thought. Proximity to failure. It'll get the job done. May not be optimal, may not be necessary, but it ensures that you're actually inducing overload at least for that set.
Mm-hmm.
Well, folks, we've come a long way. We've talked about historically why power building became a thing and how it started all the way back with fat and how it shifted to the DUP Model 1, and then how the original Schoenfeld research influenced us all, and then how some of the adaptations to our brains led us to giving different adaptations to our lifters as we better understood minimum effective dose, the power of specificity, and the relationship between hypertrophy and strength, and how it came full circle with us putting power building on a pedestal to then daring to call it an abomination, despite the historical evidence where almost every bodybuilder was also a strength athlete back in the day at a high level, and then understanding when it can be something that has a trade-off, and whether that trade-off is just going to make it harder to do and require more time investment, but getting the same bottom line, or if you are at a point where actually having a trade-off and not getting what you need out of your bottom line does happen. And if that's the case, pat yourself on the back because you're probably close to your maximum potential for strength or hypertrophy, or maybe both. And you have earned yourself the right to now specialize and focus on one or the other, or not, if you want to just be the best hybrid athlete you can be. So we greatly appreciate your time, your energy, and if you do need a coach, if you need someone to help you through being a dual athlete, we've been doing the damn thing for over a decade now. Close to 15 years, actually. And I dare say we might be some of the best hybrid athlete coaches in the game. So check us out at 3dmusclejourney.com. And thank you again for listening to another episode of the 3DMJ podcast.